A man stumbled upon a 7-foot monstrosity with a wolf's head and claws capable of ripping him apart. He dragged it into his barn and spent 40 years hiding a nightmare that should never have walked the earth. When feds finally stormed his property, they had uncovered something far more horrific than anything they had been prepared for. It was the summer of 1984 in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. John Marcus Brennan had lived on the property for 8 years by then, inheriting 40 acres of dense woodland from an uncle. According to him, he heard its first sound on August 14th while he was planing wood in his shed. He grabbed his rifle. The vocalization came a second time as he moved through the undergrowth, following the direction more than any visible trail. The smell hit him before he saw anything. Blood and infection, thick enough to taste. Then he saw movement near a fallen oak, something massive struggling against the ground. The creature was on its side, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle, caught in the rusted teeth of a bear trap that must have been illegal for decades. But it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything Marcus had a name for. 7 feet long from head to haunches, maybe more, with a body that seemed caught between human and canine in ways that made his brain refuse the image. The head was distinctly wolf-like, elongated muzzle, pointed ears pressed flat against the skull, but the eyes were wrong. Too forward-facing, too aware. They tracked Marcus as he approached, amber yellow and glowing faintly, even in the afternoon light. And there was intelligence in them that made his grip tighten on the rifle. Was it aware of him, or calculating what he might do next? The body was muscular in a way that suggested bipedal movement, shoulders too broad, arms too long, ending in hands that were neither paw nor human, but something hybrid, fingers with joints, pads and claws that had torn furrows in the earth. The legs were digitigrade, bent backward at what would be the ankle on a human, built for power and speed. Dark gray fur covered everything, matted now with blood and dirt. The trap had closed on the left leg just above what passed for an ankle, the metal teeth buried deep in muscle and tendon. The wound was infected, swollen, and discolored, weeping fluid that said the creature had been caught here for days. It made that sound again, softer now, watching Marcus with eyes that held pain and something else. Not animal panic. Something closer to resignation, to understand that this was how it ended. Did it expect mercy, or was it silently judging him? Marcus lowered the rifle slowly. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he'd grown up around animals, had spent years in these woods learning to read behavior and body language. The creature wasn't trying to threaten him. It was dying, and it knew it, and there was something in those amber eyes that looked almost like a question. Marcus heard himself speaking, his voice rough as he told it to stay easy and that he wasn't going to hurt it. The words felt absurd even as they left his mouth, yet the creature's ears shifted slightly, tracking the sound with unsettling precision. It made a low vocalization, not quite a growl and not quite a whine. Marcus took another step closer. The creature tensed but didn't lunge or snap, only watched him with those impossible eyes, alert and measuring every movement. Would it attack if he moved one step too far? The trap was old, spring-loaded steel with teeth designed to hold a bear. Marcus could see bone through the torn flesh, could smell the infection spreading through the tissue. If he left it here, the creature would die within days, maybe hours. If he tried to help and it attacked, he'd probably die instead. He stood there for a long moment, weighing impossible choices, before he turned and ran back toward his house. He returned with his toolbox, medical supplies, a bottle of whiskey, and a length of heavy chain. The creature was still there, weaker now, its breathing labored. Marcus approached slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, just keeping sound in the air so his movements wouldn't startle it. He poured whiskey over his hands and the trap mechanism, then knelt beside the creature's injured leg. He told it this was going to hurt, meeting those amber eyes, but that if they didn't get the trap off, it would die. He said that the creature made a sound that might have been acknowledged. Marcus began working the trap's release mechanism, rusted and stiff from years in the elements. Its breathing quickened, claws digging into the earth, but it didn't try to bite or strike. 40 minutes passed, Marcus's hands cramping, sweat running down his face despite the shade. When the teeth finally released, the creature let out a howl that sent birds exploding from the trees and made Marcus's heart slam against his ribs. He poured whiskey directly into the wound, and the creature's reaction was immediate and violent. A roar that was more wolf than anything else, its body convulsing, claws raking the air inches from Marcus's face. He threw himself backward, scrambling away, certain he'd just made a fatal mistake. But the creature didn't pursue. It lay there, panting, trembling, its eyes squeezed shut against the pain. Marcus waited until his own breathing steadied, then moved back in. He cleaned the wound as thoroughly as he could with the supplies he had, his hands shaking, hyper-aware of the creature's size and the power in its frame. The leg was badly damaged. Deep lacerations, possible fractures, infection spreading through the tissue in dark lines. He wrapped it with clean bandages, working quickly, and when he finished, the creature opened its eyes and looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. The creature tried to stand and immediately collapsed, the injured leg unable to bear any weight. Marcus looked at the forest around them, then back at the creature. His barn was a quarter-mile away. Getting something this size there seemed impossible. It took 3 hours. Marcus fashioned a makeshift travois from branches and rope, coaxing the creature onto it with patience and careful movements. The creature was heavy. Marcus estimated 450 pounds, maybe more. And dragging it through the forest was brutal work that left his shoulders screaming and his hands raw. The creature helped where it could, using its arms to pull itself forward when the travois caught on roots or rocks, but by the time they reached Marcus's property, both of them were exhausted. Would the barn provide enough safety, or was this just temporary reprieve? The barn was old but solid, built decades ago and used now mostly for storage. Marcus cleared the largest stall, piling hay to create a soft surface, and helped the creature inside. It collapsed immediately, sides heaving, and Marcus stood in the doorway watching it, his mind trying to process what he'd just done. He'd brought something into his barn that every rational part of his brain said couldn't exist. Something that could kill him without effort if it chose to. The creature's eyes opened, tracking him in the dim light. Marcus swallowed hard and told it to stay put. He would bring food and water, and nobody could ever know it was here. Could it actually understand him, or was he talking to something beyond comprehension? A low, rumbling sound escaped the creature, and then it did something that stole Marcus's breath. It nodded, a clear, deliberate movement of its head, as if to say yes. Marcus stood frozen, staring, realizing that it truly understood him. Another nod followed, slower this time, amber eyes locked on his face, unblinking and unwavering. Marcus felt a shiver run through him, the question forming silently in his mind. What exactly was this creature? It did not answer. It simply watched him with those intelligent, impossible eyes. And Marcus understood in that moment that his life had irrevocably changed in ways he could not yet begin to comprehend. The first week was survival. Marcus brought water in a large basin, which the creature drank gratefully, and meat from his freezer, venison mostly, some beef. The creature ate raw meat readily, tearing into it with teeth designed for the purpose, but refused bread and vegetables when Marcus offered them. Marcus changed the bandages twice daily, cleaning the wound and applying antiseptic that made the creature growl low in its chest, but never snap or strike. Could he maintain this fragile balance without being attacked? By the third day, the fever started. The creature's body temperature spiked, its breathing became rapid and shallow, and it stopped eating. Marcus sat beside it through the night, applying cool water to its head and neck, talking in a low voice about nothing. His childhood in Detroit, his uncle who'd left him this property, the carpentry work he did in town. He didn't know if the creature understood or cared, but the sound of his voice seemed to calm it, and that was something. The fever broke on the 5th day. The creature opened its eyes, clearer now, and looked at Marcus with what might have been recognition. Marcus offered water, and the creature drank, then accepted small pieces of meat. The infection was receding, the wound beginning to show signs of healing. Could he finally start trusting it? Or was this recovery only temporary? But survival raised new questions. Marcus sat on an overturned crate in the barn, watching the creature rest, and tried to think through the implications. He couldn't release it back into the wild, not with that leg still healing, not when it could barely walk. But keeping it here meant restructuring his entire life around secrecy. No visitors to the property, no contractors for repairs, no one who might hear sounds from the barn or notice the amount of food he was buying. The creature stirred, lifting its head to look at him. Marcus met those amber eyes and decided he needed a name. He couldn't keep thinking of it as it or the creature. The name came to him almost instinctively, Coda. Simple, easy to say, and vaguely fitting for something part wolf. The creature tilted its head, ears forward, and Marcus repeated the name. That would be its name from now on. Over the following weeks, as Coda's leg healed and he regained strength, Marcus began to understand the magnitude of what he'd taken on. Coda was intelligent in ways that went far beyond animal awareness. He learned quickly, watching Marcus's routines and adapting to them. When Marcus brought food at the same time each day, Coda would be waiting, alert and ready. When Marcus worked in the barn on carpentry projects, Coda would watch with clear interest, his eyes tracking the movements of tools and hands. Could he really control this intelligence, or would it always remain unpredictable? But intelligence didn't mean trust. Coda was still wild, still dangerous, and the first time Marcus made a sudden movement, dropping a hammer that clattered loudly against the concrete floor, Coda's reaction was immediate and violent. He lunged forward with speed that seemed impossible for something his size. Lips pulled back from teeth that could crush bone, a snarl ripping from his throat that made Marcus's blood turn to ice. Marcus froze, hands raised, and Coda stopped inches away, his hot breath on Marcus's face, amber eyes blazing with predatory focus. The first time Coda actually injured Marcus happened in late September, 6 weeks after the initial rescue. Marcus had been cleaning Coda's stall, raking out soiled hay, and replacing it with fresh bedding, a routine they'd established without incident for over a week. But that morning, Marcus had been careless, his mind elsewhere, thinking about a cabinet order he needed to finish. He'd turned his back on Coda while bending down to gather an armful of hay, and in that moment of inattention, every instinct Coda still carried from a lifetime in the wild kicked in. Could he survive the next mistake, or would it be his last? Marcus heard the movement behind him, a rush of displaced air and the scrape of claws on concrete, and started to turn. He wasn't fast enough. He said that Coda hit him from behind with the force of a linebacker, driving him face first into the barn wall. Marcus felt his nose break on impact, tasted blood immediately flooding his mouth, and then Coda's weight was on his back, pressing him against the wood, claws digging into his shoulders through his shirt. The pain was sharp and immediate, 4 points of pressure that felt like they were going straight through muscle to bone. Marcus didn't scream. Some survival instinct told him that screaming would make it worse, would trigger something deeper in Coda's predatory brain. Instead, he went completely still, his face pressed against the rough wood, blood running down his chin, and forced himself to speak in a low, calm voice, despite the terror and pain. The pressure on his back increased for a moment, Coda's breath hot against the back of his neck, and Marcus genuinely thought he was about to die. Then, gradually, the weight lifted. The claws withdrew from his shoulders. Marcus heard Coda move backward, heard a sound that might have been confusion or distress, a high-pitched whine that seemed wrong coming from something so large and dangerous. The second incident happened in November, when the first serious cold snap hit the Upper Peninsula, and Marcus was installing a wood stove in the barn to keep Coda warm through the winter. He'd been working for hours, running the stovepipe through the barn wall, and Coda had been watching with his usual intense interest. But when Marcus lit the first fire to test the draw, the sudden appearance of flames in the enclosed space triggered something primal in Coda's brain. The reaction was instantaneous. Coda went from calm observation to full aggression in a heartbeat, a roar erupting from his chest that Marcus felt in his bones. Before Marcus could react, Coda had crossed the space between them and struck him with one clawed hand, a backhanded blow that caught Marcus across the chest and sent him sprawling backward into his toolbox. Marcus felt ribs crack on impact, the pain so intense it whited out his vision for a moment, and then Coda was standing over him, teeth bared, that roar still echoing in the confined space. Would he survive the winter, or would this attack leave permanent damage? He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, the ache in his ribs making him gasp. Coda moved closer, and Marcus forced himself not to flinch. The creature lowered its head, sniffing at Marcus's chest, where the blow had landed, then looked up at his face with those amber eyes that seemed to understand too much. The third incident was the worst, and it happened in January during a blizzard that had buried the property under 3 feet of snow. Marcus had been forced to dig a path from the house to the barn, exhausting work that took hours, and when he finally made it inside, he was cold, tired, and not paying attention to Coda's state of mind. He didn't notice that Coda was agitated, pacing the stall with restless energy, making low vocalizations that should have been a warning. Marcus was refilling Coda's water basin when Coda suddenly lunged, grabbing Marcus's arm in his jaws. Not a full bite. If it had been, Marcus would have lost the arm, but enough pressure to break skin and hold him immobile. Marcus felt teeth scrape against bone, felt hot blood running down his arm, and the pain was so intense he nearly passed out. He heard himself make a sound, something between a gasp and a scream, and Coda's grip tightened reflexively. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Coda held him there, amber eyes locked on Marcus's face, and Marcus could feel the power in those jaws, could feel how easily Coda could bite down and end this. Then, slowly, the pressure released. Coda opened his jaws and stepped back, and Marcus collapsed to his knees, clutching his bleeding arm. Did Coda regret hurting him, or was it just instinct that drove the attack? Marcus wrapped his arm as best he could with his other hand, applying pressure to slow the bleeding, and looked at Coda across the space between them. Coda continued that keening sound, and Marcus realized with a start that Coda was as upset by what had happened as Marcus was. Maybe more so. The creature understood he'd hurt Marcus again, understood it was wrong, but couldn't fully control the instincts that drove him to violence when he felt threatened or agitated. This time, Marcus did go to a clinic, driving 40 minutes through the snow to a small urgent care facility in a town where nobody knew him. He told them he'd been attacked by a dog while hiking. They cleaned the wound, gave him antibiotics and a tetanus shot, and sent him home with instructions to watch for signs of infection. Over the following months, Marcus began to understand Coda's patterns. Marcus adjusted everything. He moved slowly and deliberately at all times. He announced his presence before entering the barn, calling out so Coda always knew he was coming. He gave Coda space, never crowding him, always maintaining distance unless Coda chose to close it. And gradually, painfully, over months of careful interaction and multiple injuries, something shifted. Coda began to trust him. It wasn't a single moment, but an accumulation of small changes. Coda stopped tensing when Marcus entered the barn. He began approaching Marcus voluntarily, sniffing at him with curiosity rather than aggression. When Marcus sat on his crate in the evenings, talking about his day or reading aloud from books, Coda would settle nearby, listening with clear attention. And most significantly, when Marcus made mistakes, dropped something, moved too quickly, startled Coda accidentally. Coda's first response stopped being violence. Instead, he would freeze, assess, and then deliberately choose not to attack. By spring of 1985, nearly a year after Marcus had found Coda dying in that trap, they had achieved something remarkable. Not domestication. Coda would never be domestic, would always carry the wild in his bones, but partnership. A mutual understanding that they were safer together than apart, that trust was possible even between species that should have been predator and prey. Could they survive the coming challenges, or was the wild always ready to reclaim its own? Marcus's scars told the story of that trust building. The crooked nose that hadn't set quite right, the claw marks on his shoulders that had healed into pale lines. The teeth marks on his arm ached when the weather changed. Each one a reminder of how close he'd come to dying, and how much Coda had learned to control instincts that ran deeper than thought. One evening in May, Marcus sat in the barn watching Coda eat, and realized he couldn't imagine his life without this anymore. The danger, the secrecy, the constant vigilance, it had become normal. Coda had become family in a strange and complicated way that Marcus couldn't fully explain even to himself. Marcus reflected aloud on the irony of it all, thinking about how 6 months earlier the creature had nearly killed him 3 times, and how now he trusted Coda more than he trusted most people. The years that followed fell into patterns that felt almost domestic despite their strangeness. Marcus expanded the barn, reinforcing the walls and adding insulation for the brutal Upper Peninsula winters. He built Coda an underground den accessible through a tunnel from the barn, a space that mimicked the natural denning behavior Marcus had read about in wolf studies. Coda took to it immediately, spending his days there in darkness and emerging at night when the world was quiet and safe. Would Coda always remain content with these boundaries, or would his wild instincts push him further? The outdoor enclosure was Marcus's biggest project, taking nearly 2 years to complete. 15 feet of chain-link fencing topped with angled barriers, covering nearly half an acre of forest that Marcus had carefully cleared of anything Coda could use as a climbing aid. The fencing was buried 3 feet deep to prevent digging, and Marcus had reinforced every joint and post with the paranoia of someone who understood exactly what would happen if Coda escaped. The first night Coda went into the enclosure, Marcus watched from the barn entrance as the creature moved through the space with obvious joy. Coda ran, truly ran, on all fours with a speed and grace that was beautiful and terrifying, then climbed trees with an agility that made Marcus's modifications to the fence top seem inadequate. But Coda didn't try to escape. He explored every inch of his new territory, marked it as his own in ways Marcus tried not to think about too carefully, and then returned to the barn entrance where Marcus waited. By early 2015, Marcus had spent 31 years living a double life. The first sweep came without warning on a cold March morning. 3 unmarked sedans rolled up the gravel drive just after dawn, their engines cutting through the stillness like a blade. Marcus watched from the kitchen window as 6 men in dark jackets stepped out, their movements coordinated and deliberate. They weren't local law enforcement. These were federal agents, and they had come prepared. Marcus met them at the door before they could knock. His hands were steady, his expression neutral, but his pulse hammered in his throat. The lead agent introduced himself without offering a badge. They had received reports of unusual activity on the property, large animal disturbances, unexplained structural modifications, and irregular supply purchases that didn't match the profile of a single occupant. They wanted to conduct a voluntary inspection. Marcus didn't argue. He led them through the house first, then the barn, keeping his pace slow and his answers vague. The barn looked ordinary enough. Tools hung on pegboards, sawdust scattered across the floor, a workbench cluttered with half-finished projects. The agents moved methodically, checking corners and tapping walls, but they found nothing. The reinforced hatch leading to the underground den was concealed beneath a false floor panel, buried under 200 pounds of lumber and scrap metal. Coda was below, silent and still, trained over decades to recognize the sound of strangers and retreat into the deepest chamber. The agents spent 90 minutes on the property. They photographed the exterior, measured the enclosure Marcus had built years earlier and later dismantled, and took soil samples from the perimeter. One agent lingered near the barn's rear wall, studying the ground where faint claw marks had once scarred the wood. Marcus said nothing. When they finally left, the lead agent handed him a business card and told him they'd be in touch. No charges were filed, no public report was issued, but Marcus understood the message. They would be watching. For the next 6 years, Marcus lived under the weight of that certainty. He reduced his supply runs, varied his routes, and installed motion sensors along the property line. But survival has limits, and by late 2021, those limits were closing in. The second sweep came at night, and it came with force. Marcus woke to the sound of engines, not 3 sedans this time, but a convoy. He stumbled to the window and saw headlights cutting through the snow, at least 8 vehicles forming a perimeter around the property. Floodlights snapped on, turning the barnyard into a stage. Men in tactical gear moved with military precision, their rifles raised, their voices sharp and coordinated. Marcus didn't waste time. He pulled on boots and a jacket, grabbed the emergency pack he'd kept ready for years, and ran for the barn. Coda was already awake, pacing the underground chamber, his breath coming in low, guttural huffs. Marcus descended the ladder and found the creature crouched near the far wall, his clawed hands flexing, his ears pinned back. They had one chance. The tunnel Marcus had dug years earlier led north through the hillside, emerging in a thicket 200 yards from the barn. It was narrow, barely wide enough for Coda's frame, but it was their only exit. Marcus grabbed the creature's arm and pulled him toward the passage, speaking in the low, steady tone he'd used for decades to calm him. Coda hesitated, then followed, his massive body scraping against the dirt walls as they moved. Above them, the agents breached the barn. Marcus heard the crash of the door, the shouts, the heavy boots on the floorboards. They were searching, tearing through the space with methodical efficiency. It wouldn't take long before they found the hatch. Marcus and Coda emerged into the forest just as the floodlights swept toward the hillside. The snow was deep, nearly 2 feet in places, and the temperature had dropped below zero. Coda moved with surprising speed despite his age, his legs propelling him forward in long, loping strides. Marcus struggled to keep pace, his breath burning in his lungs, his boots sinking into the drifts. Behind them, the pursuit began. The floodlights shifted, tracking their movement through the trees. Marcus heard the sharp crack of a rifle shot, then another, the bullet splintering bark and kicking up snow. Coda didn't slow. He veered east, cutting through a frozen stream bed, his claws finding purchase on the ice. Marcus followed, slipping twice before catching himself on a fallen log. They ran for nearly 20 minutes, weaving through dense pines and over rocky outcrops. Coda's breath came in ragged clouds, and Marcus could see the strain in his movements. The creature was tiring, and so was he. The agents were closing in, their thermal scopes cutting through the darkness, their coordination flawless. Marcus made a decision. He veered toward a ravine he knew well, a steep drop that led to a dry creek bed. If they could reach it, they might lose the pursuit in the terrain. Coda followed without question, trusting Marcus's lead even as the gunfire intensified. They descended the slope in a controlled slide, snow and gravel cascading around them, and hit the creek bed hard. Above them, the agents regrouped, their voices distant but deliberate. Marcus knew they had minutes at best. Before Marcus could stop him, Coda bolted. He didn't run toward safety. He ran back toward the agents, drawing their fire, his roar echoing through the forest like a challenge. Marcus screamed his name, but the creature didn't stop. The gunfire erupted, a barrage that lit up the night, and Coda fell. Marcus reached him seconds later, collapsing beside the creature's body in the snow. Coda's chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, blood pooling beneath him. The agents surrounded them moments later. They pulled Marcus away eventually, cuffing his wrists and dragging him back toward the property. Coda's body was loaded onto a transport vehicle, covered with a tarp, and driven away into the night. Coda's body was never returned. Federal teams secured the remains within hours of the second raid, and their internal reports later described the creature as a previously unknown canid hominid hybrid, approximately 7 feet tall, heavily muscled, with dexterous hands and forward-facing amber eyes. They noted evidence of advanced intelligence, problem-solving behavior, understanding of commands, and the ability to recognize individuals. The creature's skeleton and musculature suggested both human-like and wolf-like adaptations, confirming it was capable of bipedal and quadrupedal movement. Even partially injured, it displayed predatory efficiency and controlled aggression, which authorities concluded made it far more dangerous than any known wild canid. Marcus was released 3 days later without charges. The property was returned to him, but it had been stripped, every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence confiscated. The barn was empty. The underground den had been filled in. Coda was gone, and with him, 37 years of Marcus's life. He never spoke publicly about what happened. The federal agencies involved issued no statements, and no records of the operation were ever made public. Marcus returned to his property and lived there alone, a ghost in his own home.